I booked a 2-week holiday. I came home 14 months later. My sister had watered my plants for so long she'd given up and thrown them out about month 7. I'm Gary, 59. Birmingham, Erdington, born and raised. Right, I'll tell you straight off, this isn't one of those stories where someone clever took my money off me through a fake document or a made-up sick relative. This is just a man who went somewhere warm, found the drink was cheap and the company was warm, and the whole thing felt considerably more like living than anything he'd been doing back in Birmingham for the previous decade. And just didn't come home. The money went, obviously, can't stay 14 months anywhere without the money going. But there was no mastermind behind it. No single villain I can point at. Just me, a very long bar tab, and several women who were considerably warmer than the weather forecast for Erdington in November. Worked at a components factory for 31 years, supervisor for the last 12 of them. The kind of job where you keep your head down, get the shift out, go home, repeat. Not an unhappy life exactly, just a very contained one. Same streets, same faces, same everything, week after week, year after year. The factory. Right, people hear factory supervisor and think they understand it, but the specific texture of 31 years matters to what came after, so bear with me. You're in at 6, managing a floor of 30-odd people, making parts for things you'll never see finished, components for cars, bits of machinery, nothing that ever has your name on it at the end. The work is loud and physical, and it requires your full attention. But it doesn't require your imagination, mate, and after about year 5, you've got the rhythm of it so well sorted that most of your brain is free to just quietly run in the background while your hands do the job, and that background running, after 31 years, starts to feel like a very long wait for something you can't quite name. The last few years before retirement were the strangest. Mate, I knew it was ending. Could see the number on the pension coming up. And instead of feeling relieved, I felt something closer to scared, because the factory, for all its limitations, had given me 31 years of knowing exactly where I needed to be every morning. And the thought of mornings with no particular requirement attached to them sat in me chest like something heavy that wouldn't shift. Divorced from Sandra 12 years back, no real drama, we just wanted different things. She's fine now, remarried, seems happy enough, and I'm glad about that genuinely. 2 kids, both grown, both got their own lives in other parts of the country. And by the time I took early retirement at 57, I was living in a 2-bedroom semi in Erdington, going to the same pub on Fridays, watching the same telly and thinking, is this actually it? Because if it is, I'd like to register a formal complaint with someone. A fella I used to work with, Dave from the assembly line. He'd been to Cebu City a couple of times and never stopped going on about it. Every Monday morning without fail, telling me about the food and the weather and the cost of it, how far your pension stretches out there, how warm the people are. Dave deserves more than a passing mention, because he's more important to this story than it might look. Dave was about 5 years ahead of me, retired at 52 when his back finally gave out from 30 years of line work, and the transformation in him after he first went to Cebu was something you could actually see, mate. He came back looking better, moving easier, talking differently, a lightness to him that hadn't been there before. I'd watch him on those Monday mornings and think, whatever he's found, it's working. This isn't just a man who enjoyed his holiday. This is a man who found something he'd been missing without knowing it was missing. For about 2 years, I filed his Monday morning reports under sounds good for someone else. Then the retirement came through, and a wet October morning in Erdington finally pushed me over the edge, and I booked 2 weeks, because what else was I going to do? Sit in the semi watching the leaves come down. I landed in Cebu City on a Thursday evening, and by Friday night I already knew the 2 weeks was a problem. Not because anything bad had happened, quite the opposite, the exact opposite. Mate, I walked out of the hotel on Friday morning into heat that hit me like someone opening a very large warm oven, and the street outside was alive, in a way that streets in Erdington simply are not alive. People going in every direction with purpose and noise and colour, Jeepneys painted like moving works of art honking their way through the traffic. A market on the corner selling things I couldn't name. Smells coming from somewhere that made me stomach do something it hadn't done in years, which was express genuine enthusiasm for the prospect of food. I'd had a proper meal for about £1.50 and a cold San Miguel for 30 pence, and a woman at the restaurant had smiled at me the way people smile when they're actually pleased to see you rather than just being professionally polite about it. And I'd sat there in the evening warm thinking, right, Gary lad, 2 weeks isn't going to do it here. Not even close. I extended to a month the following morning. Rang me daughter Karen to tell her. She said, Dad, is everything all right? And I said, everything's fine, love. More than fine, actually. And she said, oh, well, that's good then. In the tone of voice people use when they're slightly worried, but don't want to be the one who says so. The drinking out there is its own thing, mate, and I want to be honest about it, because I think it matters to the story. San Miguel's 30 pence a bottle. Local rum is practically nothing, and the bars are everywhere. Proper neighbourhood bars where the locals drink alongside the expats, and nobody's performing anything for anyone. It's just people having a drink in the warm. Which is such a simple and obviously good idea that I've genuinely never understood why we don't do it more in England. I'd always been a social drinker back home, couple of pints on a Friday, Christmas party, that kind of thing. Never anything that anyone would have called a problem. But out there, the social just got stretched considerably wider, mate, because the social never really stopped. By month 1, I was having a beer with me lunch, most days, which felt entirely reasonable in the context, because in the context, it is entirely reasonable. It's 30 pence, it's warm, it's sociable. By month 3, I was having a beer with me breakfast most mornings before the day got properly started. And I want to be clear, mate, I was still functioning perfectly well. Still having proper conversations, still making what felt like good decisions, still knowing where I was and what I was doing, just with a warm, comfortable layer underneath everything that made the whole world feel slightly more manageable than it had done in the cold sobriety of Erdington. The day that didn't start with a San Miguel was the exception rather than the rule, and I'd stopped noticing it was exceptional. The women. Right, this is the part people most want to hear, and also the part I'm most conscious of telling honestly, without it sounding either worse or better than it actually was. There was a woman called Grace who worked at a small restaurant I started going to most evenings about week 3. Lovely woman, early 40s, warm, funny in the dry, understated way I find considerably more attractive than the performed kind. And we started talking properly after a few visits in the way you do when you're a regular and the staff have clocked you're not going anywhere soon. I want to describe Grace a bit more properly, mate, because I think she deserves that. She had 2 kids of her own, both in secondary school, and she ran her section of that restaurant with the quiet competence of someone who'd been holding things together for a long time without making a fuss about it. We'd talk most evenings after the rush had died down, proper conversations, about her kids and me kids, about what Birmingham was like, about what she wanted eventually. And there was a genuineness to it, mate, that I've never felt the need to revise even now, looking back at everything else. The money with Grace felt like sharing, not paying, if that makes sense. And I think it probably does to anyone who's been in something real, even if it was complicated around the edges. There's one day with Grace that sticks with me more than anything else from the whole 14 months, because it's the one that best explains why I still believe she was genuine, rather than running a game on me. Month 4, her day off, we went to a beach about an hour outside the city, just the 2 of us. And we spent most of it sitting on the sand talking about absolutely nothing of consequence. Her teaching me words in Cebuano that I got wrong every single time while she laughed about it. Me telling her stories about the factory that she found far funnier than any of the lads on the floor ever had. And there was no agenda to any of it, mate. No ask, no angle. Just 2 people having a decent day together in a place that was very easy to have a decent day in. I came back from that day thinking whatever else this is or isn't, that bit right there was real. And I still think so. Nothing happened immediately at first, mate, I want to be clear. This wasn't me wandering in and throwing money around. It built slow, same as any relationship. And by about week 6, Grace and I were spending proper time together. Evenings out, a few day trips. And I was handing over bits and pieces here and there, Nothing dramatic, paying for meals, a small gift now and then. The kind of thing any man does when he's seeing someone and the cost of living is, such that generosity costs him almost nothing. Grace stayed in me life, on and off, for most of the 14 months. And I want to be honest, mate, I think she genuinely liked me. I still believe that. She's not the one I'd describe as having taken advantage. The money with Grace was modest. A few thousand total across the whole period, and it felt, most of the time, like the natural give and take of two people spending time together where one of them has considerably more spare cash than the other. The others were different. And there were others, mate, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Because part of what the drink did was make the evenings long and the inhibitions manageable and the whole situation feel like a permanent holiday from the man I'd been in Erdington for 30 years. And that man had been, if I'm honest with you, a bit lonely, a bit overlooked, a bit invisible in the specific way that divorced middle-aged men in factory jobs tend to be invisible. And out there, I wasn't any of those things. Out there, I was interesting. I was generous. I was funny. I was wanted. And I'm not going to pretend I didn't love every minute of that, even when it was costing me considerably more than the 30 pence San Miguel suggested it should. There was a period around month 8 where I was, if I'm counting properly, seeing Grace on and off. A younger woman called Joy, who I'd met at a bar near the guest house I was staying at by then, having moved on from the hotel. And a third woman whose name I'm going to leave out, because she's the one I'm least certain about in terms of what any of it meant to either of us. And I want to be honest that juggling 3 at once wasn't something I did consciously or with any particular pride, mate. It just sort of accumulated the same way the months had accumulated, one evening leading to another, the warm blur doing its quiet work. A woman called Luz I saw for about 3 months around the middle of the whole stay. And Luz was something different, mate. Luz was the one who did have the sick mother, the school fees for a younger sibling, the small business that needed a bit of help getting started. Luz is the suspended verdict of this whole story, the one I can't resolve even now. She came across, when I first met her, as someone who'd had a harder time of things than most. Quiet in a way that suggested she'd learned to be quiet rather than being naturally so. And there was something about that specific quality, the quietness of someone who's learned it, that got under my guard in a way the warmth and the fun of the others hadn't quite managed. We were together about 3 months, and the asks started about month 2, same as these things apparently always do. The mother's medical costs first, a specific condition, blood pressure medication that she couldn't afford to keep buying regularly, about £400 spread across a few weeks. Then school fees for a brother, 15 years old, good student apparently, fees overdue. Then the business, a small food stall she wanted to set up, materials and a permit, a couple of thousand all told. I want to be honest about what I actually know versus what I suspected then versus what I know now, mate, because I think it matters more than just saying she was running a con and leaving it there. The mother existed, I met her, she was elderly and clearly unwell. The medication was genuinely for blood pressure, which is a real condition. The brother I never met but Luz showed me photos that could have been anyone. The food stall, I went with her to look at the location she'd chosen, an actual spot near a market, real enough. And she talked about it with the specific practical detail of someone who'd actually thought it through. But when the business supposedly started, when I started asking to visit it, to see how it was going, there was always a reason it wasn't quite the right time. Always something that needed sorting first. Always next week. £8,000 thereabouts, spread across 3 months, and I genuinely don't know, even now, what was real and what wasn't with Luz, because some of it was real. The mother existed. The need was real. But whether the money I sent went where she said or whether it went somewhere else entirely I never properly established, and there's a particular kind of not knowing that sits with you differently from a clean betrayal. Mate, a suspended verdict that never quite gets resolved, because the evidence is genuinely mixed, and the truth is somewhere in between, and you'll never know which side of the line was larger. When Luz and I stopped seeing each other around month 11, it wasn't a dramatic ending. She just became gradually less available over a few weeks, and eventually stopped responding altogether, which could mean she'd got what she needed and moved on to the next one, Or could mean she'd simply moved on in the normal human way that relationships end without a definitive cause you can point to. And I still don't know which it was. And that not knowing is honestly the thing that sat with me longest. The money. The full total. I avoided looking at it properly until Karen came round and made me look at it. And the avoidance was as much a part of the story as the spending itself. I knew, somewhere underneath everything, that the number was climbing in a way that ought to concern me. But the beauty of the warm blur, of the cheap drink and the warm evenings and being a different Gary in a different city, is that it makes looking at numbers feel like an unnecessary imposition on a life that is currently going rather well. And so I didn't look, mate, not properly, for most of those 14 months. Just kept the vague feeling that things were fine without ever checking whether. Things were actually fine. The total when Karen and I finally sat down and went through it properly was just over £47,000 across the 14 months. Not all of it to women, a fair portion of it just to being there. 14 months of rent and food and transport and 30 pence San Miguels that add up faster than you'd think when you're having 8 of them a day. But a substantial portion of it to the women, yes, and to the general lifestyle of being a generous man in a city where generosity is cheap and the returns on it, in terms of warmth and company and feeling like a person who matters, are remarkable. I ran out of money in the end, which is what brought the 14 months to a close rather than any decision I made on my own terms. Karen rang me one Sunday, usual weekly call, and I was 4 San Miguels in at 11 in the morning, which even by the standards I'd developed for myself by that point was early, and she asked how the finances were looking, and I told her the honest number, and she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Dad, that's not enough to get home on if anything goes wrong." And something in the practical straightforwardness of that, the specific real-world concern of a daughter who'd been quietly worrying for 7 months while her dad lived his best life in Cebu, broke through whatever warm, comfortable fog had settled around me, and I booked the flight home that same afternoon. Karen coming round in those first weeks back was different from what I'd expected. I thought she might be angry, or at least frustrated, and she was neither. She was just worried. The specific quiet worry of a daughter who loves her father and has spent 14 months not quite knowing what version of him is going to come back. She came round that first Saturday. I made us both a cup of tea, and she sat at the kitchen table and just looked at me for a moment and said, "Dad, what's going on in your head?" I told her as honestly as I could, the whole 14 months. Not the bits and pieces I'd been feeding her on the weekly calls, but the actual thing. And she sat with it all. And at the end she said, "Well, we're going to have to find you something to do with yourself, aren't we?" Said it like a practical problem to be solved, rather than a judgment to be made. And I loved her for that. The woodworking class was her idea. She'd seen it at the community centre, intermediate level, Tuesday evenings, £3 a session, and she rang me on a Monday and said, "Dad, I've booked you onto something. Don't argue." I didn't argue. I went the following Tuesday with all the enthusiasm of a man being mildly managed by his own daughter, and 7 months on it's become something I actually look forward to rather than just attend. Coming back to Erdington, nobody talks about this bit enough, the specific difficulty of the return. The flight lands at Birmingham Airport on a grey Tuesday morning in January, and I'm stepping off a plane from 30-degree warmth into 8 degrees and drizzle. And the whole city looks, after 14 months of colour and warmth and noise and being wanted in it, absolutely grey and small and very, very quiet. I stood at the baggage carousel for about 20 minutes just looking around at people in coats, grey-faced, not making eye contact, doing that British public space thing of existing near each other without acknowledging it. And I thought, oh no, I've ruined Erdington for myself. The first Friday pub visit back was a particular experience, mate. Same 3 or 4 fellas. Same conversations. Same sport on the same screen, and I sat there with a proper English pint in me hand, which should have felt like coming home and instead felt like putting a coat back on that you'd grown out of. I had 2 pints and made my excuses and walked home through streets that smelled of cold and exhaust rather than warmth and food, and I sat in the semi for a long while just looking at the wall. And I thought, right, Gary, This is going to take some adjusting to. 8 months on, mate, still in the same semi, still the same Friday pub, but it's different now, or I'm different. Karen comes round most Sundays. We didn't do that before the 14 months. The woodworking fellas, there are 4 of us who go for a pint after the Tuesday session now. Proper good company in the understated English way. A mate I hadn't seen in 3 years rang me out of the blue last month, said he'd heard I'd been away, fancied catching up, and we met for lunch and talked for 3 hours, which is 3 hours more than we'd managed in the previous decade. I still have a San Miguel sometimes, mate. In the back garden on the rare days the Birmingham weather permits it, and I think about Grace and the beach and the warm and the very specific feeling of being Gary in Cebu rather than Gary in Erdington, and I don't regret it exactly. Not the going, not even most of the staying, just the last few months, when the money was clearly running out and I was clearly choosing not to notice. If you're thinking about going somewhere and staying longer than you meant to, mate, I'd just say this. Work out the number before you go, the actual number, what you can afford to spend and still come home with your life intact. Write it down somewhere you'll actually look at it, and then look at it regularly, rather than letting the warm blur of a good time make the looking feel unnecessary. Because the warm blur is real, mate. Genuinely real. And it's worth having. But it doesn't last forever. And Erdington in January is considerably colder when you've spent 14 months forgetting what cold feels like.